Welcome back from the break. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. And again, my thanks to Esther Debliger. Just a quick note about how intrepid she is, which you now know. But yesterday she was stuck in traffic driving from Pennsylvania to here for 2 hours and turned around, not to go home, which is what I would have done, but to go to the train station to get herself here for that talk. So thank you for not giving up, for making it. It is it's my sincere pleasure to welcome now Dr. Joan Kaufman, our next speaker. Dr. Kaufman is Director of Research at the Center for Child and Family Traumatic Stress at the Kennedy Krieger Institute, which is our neighbor right here, just right across the street from us. Dr. Kaufman obtained a bachelor's degree in Holocaust Studies from Tufts University and her doctorate in clinical psychology from Yale University. Her first faculty position was at Western Psychiatric Institute and Clinic in Pittsburgh, but then she returned to Yale's Department of Psychiatry, where she served as faculty for nearly 20 years. Just last year, the Kennedy Krieger Institute was able to lure Dr. Kaufman away from New Haven to join us here in Baltimore, and we are very, very grateful to KKI for doing this. Dr. Kaufman's research has contributed substantively to an understanding of risk and resilience in maltreated children, and also to the impact of neurological and epigenetic factors in maltreatment. She served as a national expert on childhood serious emotional disturbances to SAMHSA, which is the leading government agency tasked with reducing the impact of substance abuse and mental health in America's communities. She served as a consultant to major pharmaceutical companies, including Pfizer, Bristol-Myers Squibb, and Johnson & Johnson, among others. And she has provided expert testimony on multiple child welfare-related bills when she was in Connecticut. Dr. Kaufman has more than 100 publications, including more than 60 scientific peer-reviewed journal publications and 30 book chapters. And just last week, she published her first book, a work of nonfiction entitled Broken 3 Times, A Story of Child Abuse in America. This book is available on Amazon and has been recommended as a powerful clinical, scientific, and policy page-turner to all concerned with improving services for children and families that have experienced trauma. Today, Dr. Kaufman presents her work on child abuse and on the child welfare system. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joan Kaufman to our symposium.
All right, so thank you very much for having me here. This is really an incredible opportunity, and I feel very grateful both for being at the Center for Child and Family Traumatic Stress and being here today. So the topic of my talk today is child sexual abuse and the child welfare system, but I'm going to probably take us in a couple different directions as I begin the talk. I'm going to start by talking about something that's probably well appreciated by everybody in this audience, but child sexual abuse, child maltreatment, in general, is associated with enormous economic and human costs at both the individual level and the societal level. Okay, there's estimated 700,000 substantiated cases of maltreatment each year, but we also know countless cases that never come to the attention of authorities. And as we've heard earlier today, child abuse doesn't just increase risk for psychiatric and substance use problems, but all sorts of health problems, including cardiovascular disease and even cancer. Okay, the Center for Disease Control has estimated that the cost for just 1 year of confirmed cases of child maltreatment is approximately $124 billion, with that including costs, and that's 1 year, and those are just the confirmed cases, not the cases that don't come to attention of authorities. And that estimate includes childhood health care costs, adult medical expenses, productivity losses, child welfare costs, special education expenditures, and criminal justice costs. So the need to work towards prevention is enormous. Now, many of you may or may not be familiar with the very classic studies that were done by Folletti, Anday, and colleagues almost 20 years ago. But this was the first research that showed that child abuse and neglect not only increases risk for psychiatric and substance use disorders, but a whole host of health problems and even early death. And our work has really been trying to understand what are some of these mechanisms and how can we, if we understand mechanisms, also think about improving treatments and improving outcomes. So childhood adverse experiences, a lot of people have heard about how toxic stress affects the brain. So in our work, we've been involved in doing some functional magnetic resonant imaging brain picture studies. And like in Dr. Deblinger's work, post-traumatic stress disorder is the most common diagnosis of the children that we see. And so our research, we've been involved in looking at children at time of extreme stress, shortly after removal due to abuse or neglect. And I'm going to just kind of walk you through this to just kind of introduce some of these concepts. So the task we do, so while the kids are in the scanner, they actually are doing sort of a game-like task, and it's something called the emotional go-no task. And so they'll be exposed to those different faces that you see, and sometimes the task is press a button when you see a face that looks fearful, and sometimes the task is press a button when it's a neutral face. And the reality is that we all have an aversion to kind of fearful stimuli. And it normally would take us longer because we don't want to approach those things. It normally takes longer. So I'm going to look, is this a, oh yeah, okay. So our RT stands for reaction time. So it normally takes longer to press the button when you have to pay attention to the fearful things. And that correlates with anxiety, significantly with anxiety, and that's highly replicated. So this is a data where we're looking at 49 kids. And we assess adversity, child maltreatment dimensionally. And in particular, we get information from protective services, the parents, the kids, and we create dimensional measures. And in particular, here we're looking at threat, experiences of physical abuse, sexual abuse, and domestic violence exposure. We also look at measures of social support. So one of the things, and I guess, this is a recurring theme that's been coming through in today's conference, is the importance of social supports in ameliorating the negative effects of childhood trauma. In our work, it has decreased the likelihood of children developing depressive disorders. It's decreased the likelihood of them showing HPA-axis stress hormone changes. It's also even diminished. There are certain high-risk genes that increase risk for psychiatric disorders. The effect of those high-risk genes are diminished in kids who can say, I have an adult that I can count on who can take care of me. And so we were going to look to see, does that social support measure also account for differences in the effects of trauma on the brain? And so just very briefly, what you see, so that bright yellow line there, or a spot there, is the amygdala. It's a main structure in the brain that accounts for fear processing. And what we found is a significant main effect of trauma on how much our brain activates when we see fearful stimuli, but the social support measure totally diminished that effect. So in kids with a history of physical abuse, sexual abuse, witnessing domestic violence, those forms of maltreatment, yes, we see changes in kind of fear circuitry and how the brain works, but the availability of positive social supports can diminish the negative effects of trauma on the brain. And that's a very important take-home message that because so much the early abuse leads to long-term permanent damage. What we're learning more and more is how dynamic it is and how there are things in the, children's social environment that can help flip the scales, and how important that is in working in promoting permanence and building up birth parents to be able to support children. So in addition to looking at the effects of trauma on brain development, in terms of health outcomes, in looking at children, obesity is the medical health problem that children are most apt to evidence. The other health problems don't usually develop till later in life. And what you can see, and here we used a whole more expansive intrafamilial violence. So we call it YVAX because it used to be the Yale Vermont Adversity Child Scale. And what you can see is that after controlling for age and sex, intrafamilial trauma predicts body mass index and also waist circumference, two common indicators of obesity. And we have looked at this together with a special type of genetics called epigenetics, which people may or may not be familiar with. But what we're learning is the effective genes are completely non-fixed, and that experience can change gene expression. And that's an extremely exciting thing to learn, because people used to think, okay, if it's in your genes, there's nothing you can do about it. But to me, it's like beyond fascinating that various types of experiences can change and alter our risk for various types of outcomes. And so we did something, so DNA methylation, so epigenetics are basically chemical modifications to the genes. which change the three-dimensional shape of the DNA and the likelihood of different gene products being made. And so methylation, if we all can remember back to chemistry in high school, is 1 carbon and 3 hydrogen. Okay, and DNA methylation is one of the most studied epigenetic chemical modifications to DNA that people have started to look at. And we use something called the 450K bead chip, which has 450,000 of these sites, kind of looking to see where you might see these chemical changes. So if you're testing for 450,000 things, you have to control for that. And in order for it to count, as you can see, it had to be 10 to the minus 7th. So that's 0.00000. And when we were predicting the measures of obesity, body mass index, we actually found, I think this is 7, I'm not sure if I'm counting correctly, of these methylation sites that interacted with trauma and significantly predicted body mass and obesity indexes. And I think this is some of our very first, I think this is some of the first data really showing how trauma and these epigenetic changes are actually predicting a health outcome. And this MAP2K3 is actually a gene that's been implicated in obesity before. But what I also want to highlight, because it really just highlights the infancy in where we are in this field. So you'll notice there's like these 2 sites that don't have any name. And those are regions of the DNA that aren't coding for proteins. They're called non-coding regions. And so much of science has said, let's figure out what the gene is, let's figure out what the protein is, and then we can figure out the biochemical pathways and figure out onset of illness and how to prevent illness. But the reality is that 98% of the DNA doesn't code for genes and proteins. They're non-coding regions. And for years, we've all sort of been kind of not paying attention to that. But nature doesn't work that way. And it's highly unlikely that that 98% that doesn't code for genes is garbage. And what we're starting to learn is actually it can regulate genes on totally different chromosomes. So the field is really in its infancy, but I think what's exciting is that we're learning how dynamic, genes and environments, people used to say, is it genes or is it environment? They're highly interactive, and it's a very exciting time in science to kind of be putting these different pieces together. We also looked at some imaging related to kind of food behavior, obesity, and there's neural networks related to the hypothalamus that are involved in food intake. And we did find that body mass index related to correlations within this network, and also our methylation of that MAP2K3 gene that I talked about before. So again, this is an area that we are really hoping to kind of further along. We've just recently submitted a center grant where we're proposing translational studies. Obviously in children, I can't get DNA from the brain, but we collaborate with people who work with a mouse model of neglect, so we can really do some nice synergy. And we're really hoping to kind of move this forward. So June 9th, I want everybody to send good vibes down to the NIMH because our grant will be getting reviewed, and we are hoping to be able to move this work forward. But I am going to talk a little bit and thank you for the mention of the book, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it in a bit. But for a little bit over 5 years, I had a complete and total moratorium on my work. So these are studies that I did in collaboration with the State of Connecticut Department of Children and Families, and we had a program of research that really went from neurobiology to social policy. We were involved in evaluating state interventions developed for children who entered out-of-home care. We conducted most of our research in the context of a day camp. I found it's a really fabulous way to do research with kids. They have a blast. You can do assessments without overburdening them, and you also are giving back. But when they had a change in leadership at the state level, all of a sudden someone got nervous. Oh my God, you're getting DNA from kids in foster care. Minorities are overrepresented in the foster care system. Your work is going to stigmatize minorities. And it was such an impasse that it actually took over 1.5 years to even get to the table. I mean, I had letters from the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, and that couldn't get us to the table. And this went on for a very extended, long period of time. And it was actually only when there was a change in leadership that I ultimately got access. So I couldn't recruit for my NIH studies. I wasn't allowed to do anything with stored DNA specimens, and I wasn't even allowed to analyze and write up data that I had had permission to collect. So as a scientist, my hands were completely tied. And I'm happy to say that I'm mostly back to work, and I hope soon I will be living and working in the same state. Connecticut allowed me one-time use of my stored DNA specimens, but never to get back to the multidisciplinary work. I've been working in Vermont, so I'm hoping to be able to do it all here. But anyways, so while my hands were tied and I couldn't do science, I thought, okay, well, what else can I do that will be able to potentially make a difference in this area? And that's when I came up with the idea of writing a narrative nonfiction book. And I tracked down one of the families that had actually been involved in all three of our studies, the program evaluation of the intervention state of Connecticut developed for kids who entered foster care. The kids were part of our gene-environment interaction risk for depression studies, and both kids had also participated in our PTSD neuroimaging studies. And I have to confess, when I first went looking for this mom, I really wasn't even sure she would still be alive. She was a woman with a multiple, probably 2-decade history of crack cocaine use and a history of getting in many violent relationships. And I was fortunate when I found her. She was in recovery, and they were willing to sort of participate in this project, and the children were now young adults. And so I got permission, and I got 1,800 pages of Child Protective Services records, multiple psychiatric hospitalization records. I did lots of interviews with the now young adults, the birth mother, former foster parents, former mentors, former therapists, this is the result. And so it starts with snapshots of the mother's own abusive life, fast forwards through her first involvement with Child Protective Services. And really each chapter of the book is a launching point to talking about updates of policy, practice, and science. So the daughter in the story chose the name. I asked them to come up with names. Samya, which is Arabic and it means on high, exalted. And if you get to meet her character, you'll kind of appreciate that. The boy is Siler, and the mother originally came up with the name Crystal Marie. But as people were starting to read early drafts, every time they read Crystal Marie, they were thinking crystal meth. So she agreed to change it to just Maria. And so what I thought I would do, and if it's okay, I think there's aspects of their story which highlight many of the issues that are relevant in thinking about child sexual abuse in the child welfare system. And so if it's okay, I was going to plan on reading some different excerpts from the book, and then what does that tell us about prevention as we think about these things. So the first chapter of the book is called The Snoopy Snow Cone Machine. And a Snoopy snow cone machine was sort of the first very significant gift Maria's father gave her as he began to groom her. And so this is the end of our first chapter, and I felt it was really important for the reader to understand Maria's childhood, because otherwise she's just a crack-addicted, neglectful mother. To understand her story is to understand her challenges as a parent, her struggle with addiction, and also what we need to do to be able to help prevent child abuse across the generations. Oops, let me just. Okay, so at this point, Maria is 6 years old. And this is a couple weeks after she had gotten the other gift. A few weeks later, Maria finds herself up late. Her dad had gone out before she went to bed. She is snuggling the stuffy her dad gave her the night before, but she cannot fall asleep. As she lays awake in bed, she hears him come back in through the apartment door. Her heart accelerates when she hears a crash as one of the dining room chairs falls over. Her mother and sister seem to be asleep. Maria lies still in bed, listening as she hears her father rummaging around the house. After a bit, she hears the creak of her door opening. The smell of moonshine is suffocating. She closes her eyes tight and pretends to be asleep. She then feels the weight of her father on her mattress and a cold cylinder-shaped object on the side of her head. Next, she hears a clicking sound that is all too familiar. Her father has his .38 caliber gun, and he has it cocked, like she has heard him do numerous times before, while pointing it toward her mother. She hears him tell her that he loves her. She hears him tell her that he will kill her if she tells anyone this secret. She feels the weight of his body on top of her, and she feels a burning between her legs. She feels a tear roll off the side of her face, all the while conscious of the sick smell of moonshine. She opens her eyes and looks past her father to the ceiling above her bed. There are 10 tiles across. The one right above her bed is cracked. The weight of her father makes it hard to breathe. She feels another tear roll down her cheek. The crack in the tile above her bed looks like the Mississippi River on the map her teacher showed her class in school. Another tear runs down her cheek. The tile next to the one with the Mississippi River also has a crack. She can't decide what that one looks like. At some point that night, her father leaves her room. At some other point that night, Maria finally falls asleep. The next day, when Maria wakes up, she thinks the encounter with her father was just a bad dream. But as she tries to get up off her bed, the pain in her groin lets her know it was real. And that chapter is a launching point to talking about trauma-informed systems of care. And as we think about being able to help children both for prevention and both for treatment, we have to recognize that abuse is often intergenerational. Intergenerational is not inevitable, but that we need to be thinking about how do we help parents to support and how do we help parents with their own recovery as well. And Maria basically was subjected to that until she was 17 and she left her house. We then, in the story, we fast forward to the first investigation when Seiler and Samya are 10 and 11. And it's one of these things where, neglect is not substantiated, but the family has a ton of needs. They just came from a battered women's shelter. They were then at a homeless shelter. And the case is closed with no services. And the reality is tons of cases where there's substantiated reports and have no ongoing services. But that chapter is an opportunity to talk about differential response systems, which is the way a lot of our nation's child protective services are trying to change to, instead of say guilt, not guilt, what are the family's service needs? There's a second investigation where the issue of substance abuse and child welfare comes into play, and then the children are taken into care. And at that time, Connecticut was having an experiment where almost all children who entered out-of-home care were going to group care. I have to say, our research showed the state that they were spending $10,000 more per child with no better outcome, and that's no longer standard practice in Connecticut, which is good because I'm not an adamant fan of congregate care, but we'll save that for another time. So Seiler is now 12 years old, and he's in the group care. The cottage had 13 children who were just recently removed. And he's, we're going to hear about a friend he's made at the cottage, a girl named Sabina, and there's going to be one night where he can't sleep. Back at the cottage, Seiler and Sabina continue to grow closer, spending most of their time together. One night, Seiler cannot fall asleep. He tosses and turns for hours. He decides to sneak out of his room and down to Sabina's room. He knocks on the door, but she doesn't reply. He pushes lightly at the door and looks over his shoulder when it creaks. Sabina is sleeping on her single mattress with her back to the door of the room, curled up in a fetal position. Seiler doesn't go under the covers, but he climbs on the bed and gently wraps his body around her. His cotton pajamas leave him feeling a bit cool. Seiler begins to rock his hips gently, back and forth. The rhythmic movement soothes him. He becomes aroused, and then Sabina wakes up. Sabina screams, jumps from the bed, and runs out of the room. 2 night shift staff hear her screams and come running. Sabina is crying. She repeats again and again between heaving breaths, "He tried to hump me, he tried to hump me." She refuses to look at Seiler as she speaks. The reality is about 11% of children who enter foster care have sexualized problematic behavior. 15% of kids in group care, 30% of kids in residential care. That chapter, I do a launching point to talk about racial disparities in child welfare. So after that incident of sexual acting out behavior, if anyone asked him if he was sexually abused, it was nowhere in the notes, because I did have the notes from the group home as well. What is in the notes, the day he came into care, there was a parent support aide who was working with the family. She called the child protective service worker to say, "Oh, I took Seiler out to lunch the day before. I just want to let you know he told me something happened to him that he never told anybody." And the worker says, did you ask him what it was? She goes, I didn't want to push. So there's a note in the protective services record that says something happened to Seiler that he never told anyone. The worker never followed up on it. The kid never saw the parent aide again. When Seiler first entered the group home, he had a mental health assessment, and they document that he'd been thinking about suicide since he was 4 years old. And there was no mental health evaluation. And the significance of that, and I just have to make sure, what time am I supposed to finish?
Maybe like in a minute.
In a minute? Okay, so I won't tell you more. But what I will tell you is this poor kid never got an evaluation until he was in this amazing foster home, and they yanked him out, and they said, a placement, a mistake. And so he's just started in mental health. The new worker didn't even know he had this incident of sexual acting out behavior, wants to bring him back to the group home, and they said, well, we kind of need to know that he's not an offender, that he's safe. And so the worker calls the new therapist who says, I've only met with him once. I really can't make a recommendation. And they say, well, maybe let's do it safe. Let's not put him in any homes with young children and none with girls, so no one less than 12. And so this poor kid goes through 5 placements in 5 weeks because they can't find that. He and his sister are separated. And on the day that his sister literally gets placed in the permanent foster home and they're separated, the report comes in from the psychologist that, no, he's not an offender. This kid had a horrible history of sexual abuse. He had no idea what appropriate sexual boundaries were, and we're starting him in sexual abuse treatment. So the bottom line is there's lots of ways in which we can do better by children within the system. And if I have 30 seconds? So one of my things, though, I think in terms of prevention, and I'll also just highlight our work has lots of people that make it happen. We know when kids enter the foster care system, a large number of them are going to have histories of sexual abuse and are at risk of sexual acting out behaviors. To me, that's an optimal population to think about prevention efforts with basic learning and saying, these are safe touches, these are not safe touches, these are the things you can do, and really just doing some prevention and early education as children first enter the system with the hope of being able to prevent the types of things that often happen. So thank you.